Welcome back to the shop. You might remember this project from a few weeks ago. It's a monkey pod veneer project from Veneer. I work with Veneer. We have an agreement where I make 4 veneer projects a year. This is the new veneer. It's figured eucalyptus and fumed eucalyptus. And we'll take a look at that in a minute. But before I deliver this piece to my son, it's been up in the studio for a while, I wanted to answer some questions and go over some things that you really want to avoid and just the right way to do things to avoid headaches when you're working with veneer. It's really easy to work with veneer, and all of these things I'm going to tell you is through trial and error and having things happen. If you saw this project, you know that I had an issue with the adhesion. I ended up using it's described as non-flammable. I also describe it as water-based. So I used the non-flammable contact cement and ended up having an adhesion problem. And the way I fixed it was to use a clothes iron that warmed up the surface and created the bond. And you can feel you can't, but I can. You can feel the veneer and know that there's no bubbles in it. It feels pretty good. Once you get that bond, I think you're okay. But all that being said, if you're going to go ahead and go through all the trouble of building a piece of furniture and veneer it, you may as well use the really toxic stuff. It's in the red can called weld wood. I've been using that now for more than 30 years and have never had a delamination problem. So my feeling is just open the windows, get a respirator, and just use the toxic stuff that you probably don't want to use. So I'm going to put this to the side for a minute because there's a few other things I want to tell you about. Another thing is just don't use a waterborne finish on veneer. There's ways around it, and I've done it. I know people who have had headaches using waterborne finish. I've had headaches using waterborne finishes. If you've seen some of my recent projects, you've seen me use waterborne finishes. What I try to do is shellac the piece first, or use a shellac-based sealer. And that does 2 things. It warms up the wood and brings out the natural beauty of the wood, because water-based finishes don't do anything for the grain of a nice wood like a white oak or a monkey pod or walnut, you name it. So to bring out the warmth of the wood, I always use a shellac for a sealer. That brings out the warmth. And then for a strong finish, I'll use a water-based finish. That's one way to do it. If I'm working with solid wood, I will do that. But going forward, working with veneer, I'm not going to use water-based finishes again, because even with the shellac sealer, the water can get into the grain. It's going to expand that grain, and then you can end up with waves. So I had that happen on the modern desk. Luckily, it was in a very small spot on the desktop, and I was able to put a little pressure on it with a piece of paper and a clothes iron, and I got it to go back down. Now on that piece, I did use the solvent-based weld wood contact cement, and I did seal it with the shellac, but I put a real heavy coat of the water-based finish on it, and I guess a little water got in there, expanded that wood grain, and gave me that little bubble. Now you have to be patient, because when you see it at first and the finish is wet and you've got wet finish on top of it, it looks much more severe than it will be if you give it some time to naturally go down. So that's what I did. And then I used the iron, a little heat, and I was able to get it fine. But if you're going to build something, again, just use something like lacquer is a great finish for veneer projects, or I used water locks on this, which is basically a wipe-on varnish. So Minwax makes a wipe-on varnish. Just stay away from those water-based finishes. Also, don't use a J-roller. I will have a J-roller around, and I might initially put some pressure on the veneer when I apply the veneer, but to really get a good bond, I use a piece of wood. I like a nice piece of plywood, and I use the router to put a round over on the plywood, and that gives me the ability to put a lot of pressure in one area. If you think about the surface pressure, you're talking about just this little bit. So if you were to imagine like a little bit of paint underneath a piece of veneer, if I pushed on the veneer, you would see that paint spread far out. If I used a J roller, it wouldn't spread out as far because the pressure is distributed over a wider surface. So, of course, it's important to go with the grain. You don't want to, if the grain is going this way, you don't want to be going like this because you could potentially scratch it. So basically, a lot of pressure, and always be careful near the edges because you could break the veneer inside the top or the side beyond where it's going to get trimmed off with a flush cut bit in the router. The flush cut bit in the router will often get caked with the contact cement. So periodically, I'll clean the router off with WD-40. I use a cordless router, so I just take the battery out when I'm doing something like that. If it's a corded router, I would unplug it, clean off your router bit, and before you put it onto your project, turn the router on to the side, let any WD-40 that might be in the ball bearing or something fling out so it doesn't get on your project. The last thing I'll talk about is when you use the flush cut and clean it up, you're often left with almost like a little bit of a film. And that can be difficult to get off. And if you don't do it the right way, you can end up with a problem. So this is 80 grit. I would not use 80 grit. I always use like 120 to 150 grit. And you're going to sand kind of up along, kind of like you're pushing that flap kind of up and kind of cutting it at the same time. And the reason why you wouldn't want to use a heavy grit paper is you could actually tear the fibers of the veneer off inside the surface of the finished piece. So just be careful when you do it, but it's something that does take some time. It's one of those boring details that's kind of hard to get into on a project video, but every one of my edges, I have to kind of carefully, it's just like this kind of a motion. You're kind of sanding it, and then you're, like I could do it like this, and then you kind of cut it. So it's all about just sort of taking your time and not screwing up your project. Again, don't use 80. Don't use anything coarser than 120. 120, 150, that should work. As far as anything else, I can't really think of anything else. So let's go ahead and open this box and take a look at what this eucalyptus, this figured eucalyptus and this figured and fumed eucalyptus look like. Wow, this stuff looks pretty nice. Oh man, it's in here though. I might have to cut the box. Yeah, I'm not getting that out. You can see where the veneer is, so when I cut the box, I'll use this part of the cardboard as a guide and cut right at that corner. Wow, look at that. Oh, I got 2 sheets. 3 sheets, I mean, look at that. Nice. Looks like 2 sheets of the film. Wow, look at the figure in this. This is beautiful. Really nice. Here's the fumed. And here's another. This is This is also fumed, but maybe it doesn't have as much figure, or maybe it's the same thing, but they thought maybe I would just need more. Really nice stuff, though. So now I'll start thinking about the design. Let me set this camera up. Now I'll start thinking about the design and what I'm going to make. Now that I have more than I thought I had, I'll look around and really try to figure out something cool to make. Sometimes I get a little bit like, should I make something really cool and complicated, or should I make something really simple that might be more inspiring for people to try out veneer? So, or maybe I can make two projects, a simple project and a more complicated project. If you listened to our podcast last week, Jeff and I were talking about the inspiration for one of my veneer projects. Donald Judd is a minimalist sculptor, and we talked about him, we talked about some of his work, and the piece that I'm talking about in particular are the zebra wood end tables that I made probably 6 or maybe even 8 years ago. I'll have a link to that video maybe right here and down in the description, and I'll also have a link to the podcast. Thanks for tuning in, and I'll see you next time. If you'd like to learn how to work with veneer on a simple project, check out the waste paper basket from last year. Made with 1/2-inch plywood, this is a low-cost, low-effort project that'll look really cool in your home or office. Click on the link to the plans and project video at the right-hand corner of the screen or down in the description below.